The first thing they remembered was the dust. It rose in slow, lazy curtains behind the line of panzers as they rattled along the Lithuanian road, hanging in the warm June air like a veil, catching the early sun and turning it into a pale golden haze. The clatter of tracks and squeal of road wheels mixed with the steady growl of Maybach engines, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed, to most of the men, like the sound of inevitability. Somewhere ahead, beyond the pine forests and the last scattered farmhouses, lay the Red Army, or what remained of it after 3 days of being hammered and pushed and overrun. On the turret of a Panzer III near the head of the column, Oberfeldwebel Hans Kruger leaned out of his open cupola, goggles smeared with dust, tobacco smoke mixing with the smell of hot oil and exhaust, and felt very certain of two things: that the war in the East would be short, and that Soviet tanks were not going to change that. He had seen them already, and they fitted perfectly into the stories the veterans told. Burned-out T-26s squatted in ditches like rusting tin toys, their thin plates peeled back by German shells. BT-7s, those strange, lanky cavalry tanks, lay on their sides with their tracks blown off, abandoned where their crews had run for the tree lines. They were small, narrow-shouldered machines, shaped by a doctrine that already looked like a relic. Thin armor, light guns, built more for speed than for surviving modern fire. Hans remembered how the Panzer briefings back in East Prussia had described Soviet armor in those same terms, with a hint of condescension that had quickly turned into sheer contempt once they pushed across the border and saw the reality. Broken columns, charred steel, turrets blown clear off hulls by well-placed hits. You could see it in the way his gunner, Otto, talked now on the intercom. His voice relaxed, almost amused, as if the summer of 1941 were some extended exercise with live ammunition. "Another Russian wreck on the right," Otto said through the throat microphone, as their tank rolled past a burned-out BT-7. "Looks like someone parked it too close to a pack greeting. Maybe they're just clearing space for us." "The loader," Franz added, wiping sweat from his forehead with a blackened hand, making room for German engineering. Even the driver, Lucas, who was usually the quiet one, chuckled in his compartment. The air inside the Panzer was stale and heavy with fuel fumes, sweat, and the ghost of cordite from the last engagement earlier that morning. But it was familiar, safe in the way that routine danger sometimes felt safe, wrapped in steel and confidence and the belief that their weapons were superior. Intelligence had been clear. The Soviets fielded a lot of tanks, but their quality was poor, their crews badly trained, their coordination chaotic. The Germans had a word for it: Panzerreif, ripe for tanks, and in these first days of Operation Barbarossa, it felt less like analysis and more like prophecy. Hans leaned a little further out of the cupola, scanning ahead with his binoculars. The road curved toward a low rise, beyond which lay a cluster of wooden houses, and somewhere just off the map, a river crossing they had been told to secure. The air smelled of damp earth, trampled grass, and the faint metallic tang of distant fires. They had been moving fast since dawn, pushing deeper into Soviet territory than even the optimists in the staff tent had dared to hope. Divisions on the flanks reported similar success. Shattered Soviet lines, retreating infantry, artillery abandoned in place. Here and there, rumor already spoke of vast encirclements forming like jaws around surprised Soviet armies. "Radio traffic says there's more armor ahead," crackled the voice from the regimental net in Hans's headphones. "Light resistance, old models, stay mobile, push through, don't stop for every wreck." Old models, of course. Hans smiled to himself, the leather of his headset creaking as he turned his head. On the map, tucked by his knee, the Soviet tank symbols were marked in red grease pencil, clustered around the river crossings and junctions like small, inconvenient obstacles. Just shapes, not yet stories. The veterans of France told tales about the Char B-1 and Matilda II, about how those monsters had forced German crews to work harder, to flank, to bring up 88mm guns. But here in the East, it was supposed to be different. "Russia is a colossus with feet of clay," one major had said during a briefing, and the phrase had sunk into the minds of men like Hans, who now repeated it with the same casual faith with which they loaded shells. It was almost noon when the smell changed. They had passed through another small village, the same stripped pattern repeated, doors hanging open, chicken coops smashed, carts overturned, a family's entire life scattered in a courtyard where no one remained. A thin column of smoke rose from a barn on the far side, drifting lazily. Flies buzzed around the carcass of a horse lying twisted in its harness by the roadside. And yet, in between those familiar scents of war, burning wood, charred flesh, spilled grain, Hans caught something new: the sharp, acrid edge of singed paint and hot metal, heavier than the usual battlefield haze, like standing too close to a forge. The column slowed, tracks grinding on the packed dirt. Hans instinctively ducked back into the cupola, then leaned out again as a dispatch motorcycle raced up from the rear, engine whining, a helmeted rider gesturing rapidly toward toward the front. Voices crowded the radio net. Short, clipped words, a tightening of tone that Hans recognized as the sound of officers discovering that the script had changed while the actors were already on stage. "Contact ahead," came the calm voice of the company commander. "Not confirmed. Possible heavy armor. All crews, stay alert." "Heavy armor?" Franz muttered from below. "Since when do the Russians have heavy armor?" "They don't," Otto replied, almost reflexively. "Not really. Just fat versions of the same rubbish." But there was a small pause before his last word, a microscopic hesitation, as if his brain had just realized that whatever lay ahead had made their commander change his choice of vocabulary. Hans felt the hair on the back of his neck lift just a little, like a small dog in a distant yard had begun barking at something it didn't understand. They crested the low rise and saw the crossroads. It lay about 600 or 700 meters ahead, where the road they followed met another dirt track running across their line of advance. Trees framed the intersection, scraggly pines and birches, their leaves restless in a light breeze. A wooden signpost tilted drunkenly, pointing toward names that meant nothing to most of the Germans reading them. And there, sitting smack in the middle of the junction like an obstinate boulder left by some retreating glacier, was a shape that did not fit any of the silhouettes posted on the recognition chart in Hans's memory. The tank was big, that was the first thing. Its hull sat wide and low, but the turret rose high, a squat, square-headed thing that seemed too massive for the rest of the body, like a pillbox welded onto a moving box of steel. The armor plates met at blunt angles. There were no elegant curves, no graceful slopes like on their own machines, just thick, unapologetic slabs of metal. The main gun, longer than he expected, heavy, with a counterweight ring, pointed lazily down the road in their direction, not quite aimed, as if the tank had simply turned to face them and then grown bored. The whole machine was dark with dust and soot, its green paint dulled, its tracks coated in mud. At first glance, it looked almost clumsy. "What on earth is that?" Franz breathed. Hans raised his binoculars, focusing. He saw weld seams thick and crude by German standards, but solid. Rivets were almost absent. This was welded armor. A red star, smudged and scratched, still clung to the side of the turret. On the hull, a number hastily painted in white was half obscured by dirt. The tank did not move. It simply sat there in the middle of the crossroads, gun idle, engine rumbling faintly beneath its armor plates, like a heavy animal resting in a field, sensing predators and choosing to wait. "Probably some kind of bunker on tracks," Otto said, trying to sound dismissive. "The Russians love their concrete." "Range 600, Lucas called from the driver's position, eyes squinting through his periscope. Hans watched the machine for another heartbeat, then another. No other tanks flanked it. No infantry swarmed around it. On either side of the crossroads, the fields opened up into a slight downward slope with patches of high grass and scattered trees. A few dark lumps lay near the verge, destroyed vehicles of some sort, maybe trucks, maybe the remains of an earlier Soviet attempt to hold this position. The German column behind them was bunching up, the lead Panzer IV on their left slewing a little as its commander tried to see past Hans's tank. "Company, here is one," crackled the radio. "Unknown heavy tank at the crossroads. Probably alone. Panzers, line abreast, engage and destroy. Anti-tank guns will be brought forward." The first time Hans fired at the strange tank, he still assumed it would explode. He dropped down into the turret, closing the cupola hatch with a metallic thunk that momentarily shut out the bright sky and replaced it with the dim, yellowish light filtering in through periscope slits and open cracks. The interior of the Panzer III felt suddenly smaller, more intimate. He could hear Otto's breathing, the slight hitch in Franz's movements as he reached for a shell from the ready rack. Lucas muttered something under his breath as he shifted gear, bringing their tank slightly to the right to widen the firing line. Through his gun sight, Otto now had the enemy tank framed neatly, a crosshair resting on its turret like a thin, bright spiderweb. "Armor piercing," Hans ordered, although Franz already had that type in his hands. "Target, enemy tank, crossroads, range 600. Fire at will." The gun roared, the whole turret jerking back with a familiar flash of heat and force. The smell of cordite filled the cramped space instantly, sharp and hot, mingling with sweat and the oily air. Franz had a new shell halfway into the breach before the first had even finished leaving the barrel. Through his faintly trembling hands, the cycle felt reassuring. A ritual they had performed dozens of times on the training grounds, and, recently, against far more fragile prey. Outside, on the German line, more cannons barked. Panzer IVs to their left spat thick, heavier rounds from their short 75mm guns. Other Panzer IIIs joined in, their 50mm guns flashing. In seconds, a storm of steel crossed the short distance between German and Soviet machines. White-gray puffs erupting from muzzles, trails of smoke hanging briefly in the air. Hans, peering through his cupola periscope, saw the impact, or rather, he saw the lack of impact. The shells struck the KV-1 with a series of sharp, bright sparks, like someone hitting an anvil with a fistful of matches. One round clanged against the turret front and ricocheted off at a wild angle, spinning away into the trees behind. Another seemed to vanish into a shower of metal dust along the upper hull. The only mark he could see on the enemy armor was a faint scab, a smudge of fresh, bare steel exposed where paint had been flayed off. No smoke, no burst of flame, no hole, no visible damage at all. "Hit! Hit!" Franz shouted instinctively. Then, slower. "No penetration? Adjust. Lower plate!" Hans snapped, his earlier confidence now meeting a small, cold resistance somewhere at the bottom of his chest. Again! They fired again, and again. Panzers all along the line kept up the barrage, guns thudding rhythmically, casings clinking as they rolled on the turret floor. The sound of their own cannon almost drowned out the rest, but Hans still heard, faintly, the rapid, anxious chatter starting to leak into the radio net as other commanders saw what he was seeing. The shells just bounced. Inside the KV-1, it felt like the world was being punched by a god. Sergeant Ivan Petrov could not hear individual impacts anymore. They came too quickly, a staccato hailstorm of blows hammering against the armor that surrounded his crew. The tank shook and shivered, the steel around them ringing with high notes like a tortured bell. Paint dust drifting down in tiny clouds from weld seams and hatch edges. His ears were already half deaf from the first salvos. Now the inside of the turret was a muffled, ongoing roar, where each new strike was more something his bones felt than his ears registered. Somewhere beneath his boots, the engine groaned, still pushing a low vibration up through the floor plates. He was sweating under his padded helmet, hands wrapped tighter than he knew around the handles near his cupola. Across from him, Dmitri the gunner squinted into his sight, jaw clenched, teeth bared as he tracked the German line. The loader, Grigori, moved with surprising speed for a man with shoulders like a bull, muscles working under a soaked shirt as he heaved more shells toward the breach. Down in the hull, the driver, Kolya, and the bow machine gunner, Sasha, said nothing, their world reduced to a slit of light and the command that came from above. The hits were terrifying in one sense, but also strangely exhilarating because they were still here. "Hold the line!" Ivan shouted, more to keep himself focused than because anyone could hear clearly. Dmitri, the one in the middle, with the commander's cupola, hit him again. Grigori, armor-piercing. Kolya, keep us angled. He had not expected to be alone. That morning, they had been part of a small group of KV tanks rushed forward in confusion, trying to find where the Germans were pushing hardest. Orders had come down the night before in fragments, delivered by a junior officer whose hands had been shaking just a little. Enemy tanks everywhere. Bridges threatened. Hold the junction at all costs. Don't let them reach the crossings. Their radios worked only when they chose to, and even then, the voice from the other end had sounded distant, buried under static and fear. Somewhere in the chaos, their comrades had fallen back or been destroyed. Now, when Ivan had finally rumbled his KV into the crossroads, he found himself staring down an entire German column alone. He had almost laughed, a bitter, incredulous sound. One tank against many. It was madness, but it was also simple. The road behind him led to supply lines, to retreating Soviet infantry, to wounded being dragged away on carts, to more confusion and more chaos that would only grow if those gray wolves in their narrow-skulled panzers slipped through. Here, on this dusty crossroad bordered by fields and scrubby trees, there was at least something clear he could do: stand here and not move. The first German shots had frightened him, not because of any romantic notion of courage, but because concussion and shock are physical things that no amount of ideology can erase. The tank had jolted, his teeth clacked together, light flared in his eyes with each impact. He had expected at any moment to feel searing heat, to see a jet of molten metal punch through the interior, to hear someone scream as shrapnel turned flesh into shreds. Instead, the impacts remained outside. The KV's armor, thick as a ship's hull, held. The shells screamed and howled and then, unbelievably, went away. "Still here," Dmitri growled. "Let's show them we're still here." He depressed the gun slightly, lining up another Panzer through the slit of his sight. The enemy vehicles were smaller, quicker, like irritated insects flicking their stingers at a hand they could not pierce. Their muzzles flashed, but it was when the KV-1 answered that the battlefield really changed. The 76. 2 mm gun barked, a deep-throated blast that made the smaller German guns sound like toys in comparison. The whole tank recoiled, tracks biting into the dirt, leaves fluttering on the trees nearby. Hans saw the shot coming in that strange, slowed-down way in which the human brain sometimes processes sudden danger. One moment, he was leaning slightly toward his periscope, trying to track the muzzle of the Soviet tank's cannon as it swung across their line. The next, there was a bright, hard line of smoke and flame reaching out toward a Panzer IV 2 vehicles to his left. left. The shell struck the German tank squarely on the turret front, and for an instant, everything held its breath. Then the Panzer IV bloomed. The turret hatch blew open, a geyser of flame and black smoke spitting out of the wound. Something, maybe a piece of armor, maybe part of the gun mount, shot upward in a jagged arc, spinning against the pale sky. The tank's hull twisted slightly, its tracks biting deeper into the road as if trying to back away from its own death. A second later, another shot from the KV-1 smashed into a Panzer III that had tried to edge forward, hitting the joint between turret and hull. This time, the turret itself seemed to jump, metal shrieking, then settled crookedly, smoke pumping from the gap. Figures scrambled on the rear decks, tiny dark shapes outlined against the fire. "Jesus," Franz whispered, his voice small in the hissing silence that settled for a heartbeat after the explosions. He knocked them out in 2 shots. "Stop staring and load," Hans snapped, more harshly than he intended. His palms were damp on the rim of the cupola. "Otto, adjust. Aim for the gun mantlet. Maybe we can damage the barrel." They kept firing, because that was what they knew. When something stood in your path, you shot it until it went away. But now, each shot carried with it not assurance, but a question. Otto cursed under his breath as yet another armor-piercing round struck the enemy's hull and skittered off in a spray of sparks. A 50mm from another Panzer landed on the tank's bow, leaving only a slightly deeper scar. Even the heavier 75mm shells from the Panzer VEs seemed to do little more than chip paint and ring the steel bells of the KV's plates. On the left flank, some of the German tanks tried to fan out, seeking angles their guns could exploit. The ground, however, betrayed them. Shallow ditches and soft patches of earth near the fields limited their movement, and every time one of them strayed too far from the road, their tracks began to slip. The Soviet tank, by contrast, had chosen its position well. Sitting directly in the crossroads, it could swing its turret to face any threat, its thickest armor always toward the main line of German fire. Its silhouette barely shifted as it fired again and again, methodically smashing one target after another. In the first 10 minutes, they lost 3 tanks and gained nothing. Radio chatter grew ugly. Words like ricocheting, no effect, too thick, cut through the usual clipped phrases. Somewhere behind them, far down the road, the anti-tank guns were being manhandled closer, horse teams straining, sweat soaking the tunics of their crews. But those were mainly POC 36s, 37mm weapons that had earned the grim nickname Door Knocker in France when faced with heavy Allied armor. Here, against the KV-1, they might as well have been spitting peas at a locomotive. "High explosive," Hans ordered suddenly, thinking out loud. "If we can't pierce it, maybe we can shake something loose. Optics, tracks, something." They switched ammunition. The detonations on the Soviet tank grew more dramatic, spraying dirt, tearing at the earth around its tracks, smothering parts of its hull in dust and smoke. One shell landed close enough to shower it in debris, hiding it momentarily from sight. When the air cleared, the KV-1 was still there. A few small pieces of equipment had been ripped off its side. One fender hung twisted, but the turret still turned. Inside the Soviet tank, Grigori's hands were starting to cramp. The impacts had left minor damage. Some periscopes cracked. One of the external fuel tanks ruptured and burning away harmlessly. A track guard bent inward. Sasha swore as a bolt of shrapnel came through one of his machine gun slits and sliced a red line across his forearm. He wrapped a rag around it and kept firing short bursts at distant shapes that might be German infantry trying to move up in the ditches. Ivan felt as if he had aged years in those moments. He could taste dust and the metallic tang of the air, filled with fumes and the ghost of explosives. Sweat ran down his spine under his cloth and leather layers. Every time Dmitri fired, the recoil jolted his body. Every time the Germans hit them, the tank shivered under his feet like an animal under lashes. Yet there was also a growing sense of disbelief and something like fierce pride as he realized that their armor held in a way the manuals had promised, but experience had never yet had a chance to prove. "Still here, Comrade Sergeant," Kolya said, voice tight but with a tiny shard of humor in it. "Maybe they did not lie about this tank after all." "Don't jinx it," Ivan muttered. "Watch the flanks. We are not invincible." Because they weren't. The KV-1 was a fortress on tracks, yes, but fortresses could be surrounded and starved. Their ammunition was not limitless. Grigory's supply of armor-piercing and high-explosive shells dwindled with every careful shot. The engine drank fuel at an appalling rate, just to keep the heavy tank maneuvering slightly, keeping its strongest armor toward the most immediate threats. And although the Germans had been caught off guard by the sudden appearance of an enemy tank that shrugged off their standard guns, they were not stupid. They adapted. They always adapted. The first serious adaptation arrived in the shape of the long, slender barrel of an 88. Hans heard the news before he saw it. The company commander's voice came over the net, strained and clipped. Flak 88 coming up from the rear. Secure a line of fire. Do not cluster around it. Panzers, keep the Russian occupied. He knew the weapon. Every Panzer man did. The 88mm anti-aircraft gun, originally designed to punch holes in high-flying bombers, had earned a savage reputation in France when desperate German crews had turned it against Allied heavy tanks. Its shells traveled at fearful speed, and its long barrel gave it the range and accuracy to crack open almost anything, provided you could get it into position and keep it unmolested long enough to fire. He glanced back through his periscope and caught glimpses of it coming forward. A spidery carriage, large wheels bouncing over the rough road, the long barrel swaying like a spear carried horizontally by invisible hands. Men strained at its trails, boots digging into the dirt, shirts glued to their backs with sweat. A half-track growled, towing, then detaching. Under the cover of the Panzer's continued futile barrage, the crew dragged the Flak 88 into a field off the right side of the road, struggling to angle it so that its muzzle would bear on the stubborn Soviet tank. "Keep firing," Hans ordered, throat dry. "Don't give that bastard a second to breathe." They obeyed, even if their rational minds knew that their shells were doing little more than keep the enemy's attention. The KV-1's turret tracked slowly, prioritizing targets that got too close or that revealed themselves too clearly. Another German tank tried to rush forward, hoping perhaps that sheer movement would either confuse the Soviet gunner or allow a shot at the tracks from a better angle. The KV's gun flashed and the charging Panzer turned into a heap of torn metal in the middle of the road. 88 is almost ready, someone reported. Range, 700. Firing position established. In the KV, Ivan sensed that something had changed. The pattern of impacts was different now, the direction and rhythm of German fire shifting. Through his own limited view, he caught a flash of movement in the field to his right, a gun being unlimbered, men scrambling around it with practiced urgency. It was larger than their usual anti-tank pieces, more solid, its barrel longer, its silhouette dangerous even before it fired a single round. "We have company," he said, pointing with his chin. "Dmitri, that gun in the field. Prioritize." "Already on it," Dmitri muttered, traversing. The turret motors groaned. The KV's heavy turret did not swing like the nimble German cups. It trudged through its arc like a massive door being forced open against the wind. He aligned the Soviet crosshairs on the knot of men and metal, just as one of the Germans lifted his arm and shouted something. The 88 fired. The crack of it was different from the rest. It wasn't just louder. It carried a harsher, flatter sound, like an enormous whip snapped across the sky. Hans saw the muzzle flash, brilliant and sharp, a narrow spear of flame. He tracked the round's path invisibly in his mind. High velocity, straight, unforgiving. It hit the KV-1's front plate just below the turret ring with a vicious spark and a sudden plume of dust and smoke. The impact looked, from the outside, similar to the 100 others that had struck before, but this one did not bounce. The shell bit into the armor. For a moment, the KV seemed to absorb it, metal gritting against metal. Then a spall of steel blew inward on the other side like shrapnel from a grenade. Inside, the KV became hell. Ivan felt the hit as a physical blow, a sudden hammering that punched the breath out of his lungs and made his knees buckle. The sound inside the tank was not like the earlier clangs. It was deeper, malicious, followed by a spray of bright, white-hot shards ripping off the inner face of the armor and scything through the cramped space. Dmitri screamed once, high and short, then his voice cut off. The gunner's shoulder exploded in a fine red mist. Fragments tore into his chest, face, and neck. Grigori behind him shouted a curse that turned into a ragged cry as a shard caught his left hand, tearing fingers away like paper. Kolya in the hull cursed in a low, shocked tone that might have been a prayer. For a heartbeat, Ivan froze, his mind refusing to accept that the invulnerability they had begun almost to believe in had just been ripped open. Blood spattered the inside of the turret, painting the breach, the sight, his own gloves. The air stank of cooked metal and copper, and something else he did not want to identify. Dmitri slumped against his harness, his head lolling at an unnatural angle, eyes wide and empty. "Dmitri," Ivan shouted, grabbing his shoulder out of sheer instinct, as if shaking him could undo physics. The gunner's body was limp. "Dmitri!" Another 88 round slammed into the KV's hull, this time lower, aiming for the driver's compartment. It struck a track link, shattered it, then punched into the side. Kolya screamed, a raw sound that rose and fell as fragments carved through his legs. The tank lurched, its mobility suddenly crippled. One side of the track snarled with broken links, clanking and grinding. "We need to get out of here," Sasha rasped, voice thick, staring at the blood pooling on the floor plates. "We're finished." "No," Ivan barked. fighting down his own rising fear with something like anger. We hold. We keep them off that road as long as we can. Grigori, can you load? Grigori stared at his mangled hand, then at the shells stacked so close, so heavy. He swallowed once, his face pale under a mask of grime. Yes, he said hoarsely. I still have one good hand. His movements were slower now, awkward, but he kept going, shoving another shell into the breach with his uninjured arm and whatever help he could get from the ruined one. Ivan grabbed the gunner's controls himself, pushing Dmitri's body aside with a muttered apology that felt like a betrayal. He peered into the sight, blinking rapidly to clear blood that had splashed across the glass. Outside, the Germans watched as the KV shuddered under the 88's assault. Penetration, someone called on the net, relief and excitement mixing. We got him. Again, the battery commander snapped. Keep firing until it burns. The next round struck the turret side. Another shower of sparks, another inward explosion of shrapnel. Part of the KV's turret roof peeled back at the edge. A jagged flap of armor twisted upward like the lid of a tin can. Smoke began to seep from the tank's hatches. Not the sharp flame of ammunition cooking off yet, but the dark, thick tendrils of something burning inside that should not burn. Even so, the tank's gun fired again, almost in defiance, and the 76 2mm shell smashed into the field where the 88 sat, killing 2 men in a sudden burst of earth and steel, flipping one of them backward like a ragdoll. Hans felt a twisted respect flare in his chest. The Russian was dying, that much seemed clear, but he was taking payment as he went. He just hit the gun, Otto muttered. Half horrified, half admiring. He's still fighting. Let the 88 finish the job, Hans said. We stay back. No need to get closer. In the KV, the heat was rising. Flames licked at oily rags, at spilled fuel, at paint. Grigori's breath came in ragged gasps as he loaded another shell with trembling hands. Blood dripped from his ruined fingers in dark blotches on the floor, mixing with grease. Kolya was trying to staunch the flow from his legs with a belt, his face gray, lips moving in silent curses, or prayers, or perhaps both. Sasha's machine gun had fallen silent. There was little point in spraying bullets now. Sergeant, Grigori said quietly, almost conversationally between spasms of pain, we can still fight a little longer. After that, we cannot move anyway. If we stay, we block them. If we leave, they pass. Ivan thought of the orders. Hold the junction. He thought of the retreating columns he had seen earlier, the frightened faces of infantrymen trudging along roads that led back toward the east, toward homes that might now be within reach of German artillery. He thought of his wife and daughter, far from here, and of how little any of this would matter to them unless someone, somewhere, slowed the enemy long enough for the front to stabilize into something less than disaster. He also thought, very briefly, of simply opening the hatch and climbing out into the sunlight, into the fresh air, away from the growing furnace around him. We stay, he said at last. His voice was steady. As long as the gun can fire, we stay. They did. The KV-1 continued to spit shells at the Germans. Slower now, but still deadly when they hit. Another Panzer on the flank took a devastating blow, its side armor folding inward. The 88's crew, reduced but not broken, kept their own fire coming, each round chewing more out of the Soviet tank's armor, peeling and ripping, turning its once solid shell into a torn, smoking husk that somehow remained upright. Time stretched. Minutes felt like hours. For Hans and his crew, watching from a cautious distance, the duel acquired a surreal quality, like watching two boxers who had begun the match with swagger, and now, bloodied and staggering, refused to fall. The arrogance that had colored their jokes that morning was gone, replaced by a sober, almost grim appreciation for the enemy's machine and the men inside it. No one in his turret laughed anymore when shells bounced. They took note instead of where the hits landed, of what finally penetrated, of the cost in lives and ammunition required. At last, after what felt like an eternity, the KV's gun fell silent. Smoke now poured from its hatches in thick rolling clouds, tinged with orange deep within. Flames flickered up from gaps in the turret roof. There was no movement visible on the outside, no desperate crewman flinging open a hatch to crawl out into German fire. The tank simply burned, methodically, like a furnace being banked with coal. The 88 fired one more time for good measure, its shell punching through the side and exiting in a burst of fire on the far flank. Cease fire, the company commander ordered. All units, hold fire. Infantry and engineers forward. Check it. A strange quiet settled over the crossroads. The usual background noises of battle. Distant gunfire, shouted commands, the occasional crack of a rifle, seemed muted here, as if even war itself were pausing to watch what would happen next. The dust began to settle again, turning the sunlight into shafts that slanted across the scene, catching on the smoke rising from the wrecks. Hans climbed out of his cupola, boots landing on the hot armor of his own tank with a small thud. The air outside was heavy with the smells of burning rubber, gasoline, and scorched paint. He slid down the side of the Panzer and walked cautiously toward the KV, hand resting on his pistol pistol out of reflex, though he doubted there was anyone left inside to shoot back. The Soviet tank loomed larger up close, its presence even more imposing when you were at its feet instead of facing it from across a field. The armor on its front looked thick enough to stop a man-sized chunk of the world. He could see the scars now, hundreds of them, each scratched circle of shiny metal marking where a German shell had struck, sparking furiously, and done nothing more than polish the steel. It looked like someone had hammered nails into a giant's chest and failed to draw blood. God, Franz murmured beside him, having joined him on the ground. We hit it with everything. Hans reached out without thinking and laid his palm flat against the armor. It was hot, almost too hot to touch, and he pulled his hand back quickly with a hiss. The metal felt alive, not in any mystical sense, but in the way that something that had absorbed so much violence could still hold it, radiating the memory of every blow back into the air. On the turret front, near the gun mantlet, was a particularly deep gouge where one of their own 50mm shells had struck. It had bitten a few millimeters into the armor, then deflected. To the right of it, a jagged hole marked where an 88mm round had finally punched through, tearing a warped, fist-sized tunnel into the interior. Black soot ringed the wound. Through the gap, Hans could see only darkness and a faint, flickering glow from embers deeper inside. "Get that hatch open," one of the engineers called, stepping closer with a crowbar. They levered the turret hatch up, grimacing at the heat and the smoke that billowed out. The air that escaped was a choking mix of burnt oil, charred metal, and something else that made Hans's stomach knot. He turned his face sideways, breathing through his sleeve as he peered in. At first, all he could make out were shadows and twisted shapes. Then his eyes adjusted, and he saw the outlines of bodies where they had fallen. Harnesses still wrapped around shoulders, hands frozen in their last tasks. One man lay slumped over the gun's breech, head almost separated from his neck. Another lay curled near the floor, legs mangled. A third sat with his back against the turret wall, as if merely resting, until you saw the way his chest had been torn open. For a moment, the noise of the world faded for Hans. The men around him were still talking, engineers muttering about charges, officers discussing the next objectives, but their words seemed to come from far away. All he could hear clearly was the soft crackle of something still burning inside the KV, and the faint, weary sigh of air escaping as the tank's interior cooled and contracted. "We're to tow it off the road once it's safe," the engineer said eventually. "Command wants to examine it, measure the armor, work out what we're dealing with." "What we're dealing with," Franz said quietly, "is something our guns can't kill easily." Hans nodded, but said nothing. His mind had already jumped ahead. The reports this encounter would generate would travel upward, from company to battalion to division to army. Somewhere, staff officers would read about a single Soviet tank that had held up an entire column for hours, that had shrugged off hundreds of standard shells, that had forced the deployment of one of their precious 88s just to put it down. Numbers would be compared, armor thickness estimated, penetration tables recalculated. Designs for future tanks and guns, some already on drawing boards, would be stamped with new urgency. Later, weeks and months after the dust of that Lithuanian crossroads had settled, and the war in the East had turned into a grinding, endless struggle, those reports would feed into decisions that birthed names like Panther and Tiger. German engineers, pride stung and curiosity piqued, would pore over captured KV-1s and T-34s, running thumbs along welds, measuring slopes, muttering about weight-to-power ratios and ballistic performance. They would design new armor, new guns, new shells meant to ensure that no German crew would once again stand dumbfounded as their shots bounced harmlessly off a Soviet tank. But standing there in June 1941, with smoke still rising and the bodies inside the KV slowly cooling, Hans did not think about future models or industrial output. He thought about the morning's easy jokes, about the word toy tossed around to describe Soviet armor, about the casual contempt they had all felt when rolling past the flimsy wrecks of T-26s and BT-7s. He looked now at the battered hulk in front of him, at the scars their weapons had left without killing, and felt that contempt melt into something more cautious, edged with respect and a shadow of dread. "They laughed at them," he said, half to himself, "until the shells bounced." Franz glanced at him. "Who did?" "We all did," Hans replied. "This morning, yesterday, but not anymore." He turned away, the sound of engines starting up again, pulling his attention back to the business of war. The column had to move. The road behind was filling with more vehicles, more men, more equipment. They would swing around the KV's still smoldering corpse, their tracks grinding over the marks where its own had bitten into the dirt when it first rolled defiantly into the crossroads. The war would move on, as it always did, leaving the places it scarred to become stories told by those who survived. For Ivan and his crew, there would be no stories told in their own words. They remained where they had fallen, anonymous inside a charred shell that would, in time, be dragged off the road, stripped for parts, maybe melted down in some rear area workshop. Their names might appear in a report, a list of missing or killed, a line in a ledger that no one outside their family would ever read. Yet the effect of what they had done, of the hours they had bought, of the shock they had inflicted, would echo far beyond that junction. In German headquarters, officers who had once spoken lightly of a colossus with feet of clay would now correct themselves when the topic of Soviet armor came up. In Soviet factories, word would filter back that their heavy tanks had withstood incredible punishment, bolstering the argument to produce more, to improve engines, transmissions, guns. On countless fronts over the next 4 years, men would climb into KVs and later IS series tanks with a slightly different sense of what their machines could endure, and other men would face them with heavier guns and more complex fear. The crossroads in Lithuania, anonymous to most maps, became part of that quiet turning point. The moment when German panzer crews learned that not every enemy tank would crumple when hit, that some would stand stubbornly in the road and refuse to die, forcing them to bring their very best to bear. It was an unwelcome lesson, paid for in German lives and Soviet blood alike, etched in steel by the pattern of ricochet scars and the round black mouths of shells that finally found their way in. As the afternoon wore on and the sounds of moving columns faded into the distance, the KV-1 sat alone in its place, its inside a burnt tomb, its outside armored hide shimmering in the heat. The sunlight played over the scores and gouges, picking out each impact in turn, as if counting them. If metal could speak, it might have said, simply, "I was mocked." Then they learned, and somewhere further down the long, brutal road of the Eastern Front, future panzer crews would remember the stories that filtered back about those first encounters. They would remember how the men in 1941 had once laughed, and how the laughter had died on their lips when their shells just bounced off.